Good morning, and thank you for joining us on the live social networking town hall. I'm Senator Mark Kirk of Illinois. I've been the junior senator for Illinois for almost a year now. Congress right now is debating spending and other legislation, particularly the Defense Authorization Bill, which governs policy with regard to our men and women in uniform. Big issues there are detainee policy, people at Gitmo and other terrorists that we might pick up. Also, an amendment that I will be offering regarding Iran. As many of you know, Iran has been persecuting 300,000 Baha'i citizens. They arrested an actress the other day for for not wearing a headdress in an Australian movie. They sentenced her to 90 lashes. And we had a critical International Atomic Energy Agency report saying that they're pretty close to a nuclear weapon. That's why we're going to be considering an amendment that I will author. Based on the Schumer-Kirk letter, 92 senators said we should sanction the Central Bank of Iran and collapse it. I think tough, new crippling sanctions are the best way to avoid conflict and especially pressure on our allies from Israel. I'm pleased today to be joined by my successor in the House of Representatives from the 10th Congressional District of Illinois, Congressman Robert Dold. Thanks for being here.
Thanks for having me, Mark. It's great to be with you. Well, I certainly want to thank Senator Kirk, and I want to take this opportunity to give you an update on some of the issues that we've been dealing with in the United States Congress. Next week, the Super Committee is tasked with putting forth a recommendation to reduce our nation's skyrocketing debt. I believe we've got no choice but to come together with a bold bipartisan plan that takes every option into consideration. Whether it's closing corporate tax loopholes, tax breaks for special interests, reining in spending, or finding ways to support small businesses, we must move forward with a plan that puts people before politics and progress before partisanship. For years, hardworking taxpayers have given money to the government and have also been expected to live within their means on a budget to do more with less. I believe that Washington needs to learn how to do this as well. Rather than continue to ask you to give more and more of your resources, Washington needs to learn how to prioritize and spend money more wisely. One of the keys to getting our economy back on track is by creating jobs. While the government can't create jobs, they can implement smart policies that empower small businesses to expand and create new jobs. I agree with the President on several of the areas of his jobs bill, from passing the free trade agreements to removing burdensome requirements and regulations on small businesses like the 3% withholding tax, which we sent over to the Senate and they've sent back, to investing in infrastructure. I think that we must move forward on all of these areas of agreement. We don't have time to waste. The American public expect us to move forward. There are some communities, even within the 10th District, that are experiencing unemployment over 20%. Those without a job can't afford Washington to engage in politics. They need a solution, and they need it now. That's why I continue to advocate for bipartisan solutions that puts people before politics to move America forward.
I want to thank Congressman Dold for joining us. Please let us know on Facebook if you like this format. I think this is the first time, maybe, that we've done this in the Senate studios. Over the past several days, Congressman Dold and I have asked our Facebook friends and Twitter followers to submit questions for our live social networking town hall. We received questions on a variety of topics from people all over the state of Illinois, and excited to have the opportunity to answer. So let's get started. Our first question comes from Maceo in Waukegan, and his question is, what is your proposal on tax reform? And the quick answer that I would have is the bipartisan Simpson-Bowles tax reform plan is the one that I'm backing. Eliminate lobbyist loopholes, and make sure that we do defend your mortgage interest and charitable deduction, but wipe out just about everything else. That raises about $2 trillion. Use $1 trillion to lower the deficit and another $1 trillion to drop the top rate from 39% to 29%. When I talk to the backbone of employment in Illinois, small business employers, they don't really take advantage of many of the lobbyist loopholes. This dropping of the top rate is probably the best stimulus that we can do for the economy, and it helps reduce the deficit because of the other $1 trillion used in the plan. I think that's the best way to go, but let me kick it to my colleague here.
Well, I think comprehensive tax reform, no question, is one of the things that we need to do. You've heard the President talk about comprehensive tax reform. The Simpson-Bowles Commission talked about comprehensive tax reform, and I think it's absolutely critical. We have to close the corporate tax loopholes, the lobbyist loopholes out there, so that we can lower the rate and allow the country to be more competitive in the global marketplace. Right now, the world's flatter than it's probably ever been. We want to make sure that companies in the United States can compete with those all across the globe. So I think by doing that, we can broaden the tax base. We also ought to think about repatriation. There's about $1.2 trillion of resources of American companies that are sitting overseas. If we can bring those dollars back here to the United States and invest them in the private sector,
let me just
I think that'd be
kick
good.
in on repatriation. So Chairman Camp in the Ways and Means Committee has said that he approves that. We've got about $1 trillion in profits made by American multinational corporations, but they don't want to bring it home because America now has one of the highest corporate tax rates in the world. If we do drop the rate, then a tremendous amount of those profits will come home, and we can do some stuff with it.
They've said it's on average about $50 billion will go into the U.S. Treasury in terms of taxes, and those dollars would be then put into the private sector to invest back in and create additional jobs. I think it makes a lot of sense.
Let's go with our next question.
Let's go to the next question. The next question is from David in Deerfield. It says, Congress is dysfunctional by many, if not all, metrics, and how can it be fixed? And I think that's certainly a great question when we look at how Congress can come together. And certainly, I think, and one of the things that I've been advocating for is putting, again, people before politics and progress before partisanship. I certainly think that we need to be focusing on jobs in the economy. I don't care who you ask, David, on what side of the aisle. The number one issue that we face is jobs in the economy. The President came before the Congress to talk about his jobs plan as opposed to saying just outright we don't want to have the President's jobs plan pass. I've been advocating about what areas of agreement do we have. And I think there's areas of agreement when we talk about the trade agreements that were out there. Certainly there's agreement when we talk about stifling regulation for small businesses, which create 2/3 of all net new jobs. And so we passed the 3% withholding that would impact federal, state, and municipal governments that do business with outside companies. And so I think we need to be focusing on that, and whether that be some additional tax breaks by the companies in terms of payroll taxes. I authored a bill to actually do just that. So I think we've got some areas of common ground that we need to focus on, and that's what we're going to continue to do. But
yeah, I think the President's jobs plan can be passed in parts because Republicans on Capitol Hill do support significant parts of it, like payroll tax deduction provision, which actually, as the President rightly said, was a Republican idea. And if I think that came separately, it would shoot through the Congress. The President was for free trade with Colombia, with Panama, and with South Korea, and those tended to be big bipartisan victories. And then the macro picture is Simpson-Bowles, and I think not just the tax provision, but the provision to reform entitlements to make sure that we differentiate ourselves between the United States' hopeful record of fiscal responsibility as compared to the Southern European record of fiscal irresponsibility is essential in keeping interest rates low and defending the value of the dollar so that we can be different from what's happening in Europe.
And just to add one last thing, the Financial Services Committee, of which I sit on, we just passed 4 bills out of the committee and passed out of the House of Representatives with over 400 votes on each of these bills talking about access to capital for small businesses. And just yesterday there was a bipartisan, bicameral press conference talking about trying to go big for the super committee, talking about trying to put everything on the table. So there was over 100 of us that have signed a letter in the House and over 40 that have signed a letter in the Senate.
That's right. Well, let's go to our next question, and it's on Facebook from Michael. Is the Republican leadership in Congress deliberately stalling on or opposing anything proposed by President Obama, regardless of the merits of the bill proposed? And the answer is yes and no. Obviously, we do have some partisans of the far left and far right here in the Congress who basically don't like anyone from the other party. That's not either one of us. I think as we just described, the 3 free trade agreements that President Obama put forward were rapidly approved by the Congress. The payroll tax deduction idea, I think, would shoot through the Congress if brought up individually. The 3% withholding on federal contracting, the Senate and the House have both agreed that that's a good thing to do. I think it's overwhelmingly likely the President signs that. And then I think the super committee should go big. By the way, going big means not just cutting $1 trillion from expected federal borrowing over 10 years, but $4 trillion. And I think despite all of the ups and downs you hear from the debate from the super committee, it's going to be overwhelmingly likely that it passes, and I think the President will sign that. So Despite what you may see on the left on MSNBC or the right on Fox, I think prospects are better than you would expect for how this place wraps up its work. But
well, and I would simply say that we have put things forward that the president has advocated for, and certainly, again, going back to the area of trying to find that common ground, which I think the American public so desperately wants us to do. Find the common ground so that we can move forward, so that the country can actually get something past the United States Senate to the president's desk for signature. You're going to hear more and more about a do-nothing Congress, and certainly that's not our goal. Our goal is to try to make sure that we are passing legislation that actually puts people back to work. We've got a number of bills that we've passed through the United States Congress that we've kicked over to the Senate. We'll continue to do so, just like the 4 that passed with over 400 votes just a couple of weeks before now, right?
Well, like this afternoon, I think the Senate is going to pass a 3 appropriations bill and another continuing resolution, all agreed on between a Democratic Senate and a Republican House.
Yeah, I think that's important. The American people are depending on us to do so. Yeah. Let's go on to our next question. The question is from Melanie in Frankfurt. Why would we put so much into the value of nuclear energy when nuclear plants have had such huge risks to the environment? I would simply say that when we look at nuclear energy, it's clean, it's safe, we know how to do it, but there are some concerns. And in talking, I think that there are certainly, when we look at our energy policy in general, I know that Senator Kirk and I are on board in terms of 4 things that I think we ought to do with regard to energy. First is I think we ought to give a green light to renewable energies, whether that be wind, biothermal, whatever that may be, because those are scheduled to expire in the tax code in 2012 and 2013. I think we ought to be ending the fuel monopolies. There are 17 different monopolies throughout the United States right now. I think we ought to be talking about trying to increase our domestic production of oil so that we can wean ourselves off dependence on foreign oil, and that means getting back to work in the Gulf of Mexico. And that also means, lastly, about trying to do some exploration with regard to natural gas. We've got trillions of cubic feet of natural gas in many of the states throughout our country. Certainly in Illinois, we've got the New Albany Shale Reserve, which is trillions of cubic feet back home in Illinois. So I know that in talking to a number of the companies that are involved in energy, that's something that they're looking at in terms of how do we move forward on natural gas. But we do need to also talk about Yucca Mountain, taking those spent fuel rods that right now are up in, for instance, in Zion. We need to get those out of Zion, which is just a few hundred yards away from the greatest natural resource I think we've got in Lake Michigan, and taking those out to Yucca Mountain. 1,000 feet below ground, 1,000 feet above the water table, the appropriate spot to put those things. We've spent over, I think, $13 or $14 billion on that already.
Yeah, I would just agree with Congressman Dold that on all of the above energy strategy is the right way to go. So we back a new and renewable American-made energy, wind, solar, hydro, geothermal. We drill in the Gulf of Mexico. We should approve the Keystone pipeline that brings foreign oil, but in this case it's Canadian oil instead of Venezuelan or Iranian oil into the United States. That we back conservation programs, and we do this all with an emphasis on American-made energy like natural gas. Yeah. But with regard to nuclear power, obviously we should have some concerns. We saw what happened at 3 Mile Island, the Fukushima disaster. Illinois relies on nuclear power more than any other state with 11 nuclear reactors, and at each one of those reactors we're storing nuclear waste, like at Zion. Now moving on 30 years at that facility. Just a couple hundred yards from Lake Michigan, 1,000 tons of highly radioactive spent nuclear fuel. I think the policy of our government should be to protect the ecosystem of the Great Lakes, to protect the Mississippi River Basin by moving highly radioactive nuclear fuel to Yucca Mountain, a place by federal law which has to be 100 miles from human habitation, one of the driest places on Earth, and inside a mountain, above the water table but far beneath the ground. That's why we've had now almost 30 senators sign a letter on behalf of the House position on Yucca Mountain, so that eventually we have all of this nuclear waste, especially taken away from the Great Lakes. Our next question is from Bob on Facebook. What is Congress or the administration doing to stop up to 10% of fraud in Medicare and Medicaid? And that is a very good question for the Super Committee and what we're doing next week in the Congress. These programs are essential for the health care for millions of Americans. For example, my mother absolutely depends on her Medicare. But even the accountants and analysts at Medicare and the GAO will report that almost $60 billion of taxpayer money is wasted on fraud and abuse inside the Medicare program. That's why I think one of the things that we should do is upgrade the Medicare card. The U.S. military upgraded its ID card a long time ago. This is what the new ID card looked like, and it's called a Common Access Card. Unlike the Medicare card, which if you look at your Medicare card, it's just on a piece of plastic. It has your Social Security right on the card, and no picture. It has almost none of the modern upgrades for security. The military card, now 20 million of these issued, not yet one successfully counterfeited, with a computer chip, a barcode, a picture, optically variable ink, safety upgrades on the back. We think seniors should be able to have a secure Medicare card that would help us reduce fraud, waste, and abuse. This is a mock-up of what the card would look like, and it would cost about $8 each. I think this is legislation the Super Committee should consider, because if we reduce that $60 billion in Medicare fraud, by the way, that's 3 trips to Mars that we could fund per year out of Medicare fraud. It would really help our bottom line.
Well, I agree, and there's legislation out there that Senator Kirk and I have certainly supported to reduce fraud charges. And when we look at the fraud charges that are out there, Senator talked about the opportunity to save about $60 billion annually. And it's just common sense. We've got a biometric that's on there to make sure that the service that's being provided to the senior is actually the one, and the senior is actually getting that service. Also, with regard to heavy equipment, whether that be wheelchairs or oxygen and those types of equipment, that they actually go to its intended beneficiary at the end. So this is some common sense legislation that I think is out there, and I think that's something that we can do. We know that the Department of Defense has already issued this type of card, and it's something that we can do to have some significant savings for all those that are using Medicare each and every day. So let's.
And I would say also something we agree on is that the health care law that Congress passed tremendously cut Medicare by almost $500 billion. And I think we should repeal that law. We should make sure that the government can't take over health care, that those cuts to Medicare were tremendously damaging inside the health care bill, and I think we would do us all a favor by letting that legislation go. It's amazing to me that one of the largest entitlement programs in the history of the country, the health care law, the administration thought it would become popular. But actually the American people strongly disagree with passage of this legislation, and I hope this thing can be changed in the next Congress.
Well, I certainly hope so as well. And if we look at it, not only are we taking the over $500 billion out of Medicare in order to try to fund it, there's also the IPAB, which is the Independent Payment Advisory Board. So you've got 15 unelected bureaucrats that are responsible, in essence, to no one, that are going to determine what types of services you're able to get and what services you're not able to get. I think that's the wrong approach, and certainly something that we need to turn around. Yep. Let's jump on to the next question. Question from Facebook from Brad in Roscoe. What would you consider a bill mandating the executive branch to employ zero-based budgeting for all foreign aid, and where each and every expenditure would require an approval by a recorded vote from Congress? Well, while I do embrace zero-based budgeting, and I think that I've certainly got a bill that I just introduced with Congressman Quigley in the House talking about truth in government accounting, which would put zero-based budgeting in generally for how we account for things. I do want to take a word of caution with regard to foreign aid. Foreign aid, I think, when we look at it, there is a study that was done throughout the United States when we asked the American public, how much do we actually spend in foreign aid? They came back and thought we spent approximately 25% of our budget on foreign aid. When we said, well, how much should we spend? They said, well, maybe only 10%. In reality, we spend 1% of our resources on foreign aid. I would argue it's some of the best money that we spend in terms of trying to make sure that we are spreading American influence. Certainly when we look at our one true ally in the Middle East in terms of trying to make sure that Israel has the foreign aid, 75% of that foreign aid is spent here in the United States. But we do need to do a better job, from my perspective, in terms of following those dollars to make sure that they are spent in the way that we have had them designed, so that they're not going and falling into the wrong hands.
Yeah, and I would just say we can make budget reductions in foreign aid, especially military assistance to Pakistan. The State Department and Secretary of State Clinton, the Defense Department, Secretary of Defense Panetta, our former chief of the Joint Chiefs, Admiral Mullen, all have said that The intelligence service of Pakistan is a supporter of terrorism, especially the Haqqani network, that has now become the #1 threat to the Afghan government and the NATO mission in Afghanistan. And yet we give them almost $1 billion a year. I think it's time to end military assistance to Pakistan. And we just saw a growing scandal regarding the Pakistani ambassador to the United States that may have made the recommendation that the head of Pakistan's intelligence service be demoted or fired. A correct move if he actually did recommend that. And I hope that civilian government gets more control over its military and especially its intelligence service. And this is one area where, you know, feeding starving kids in Somalia, backing up key allies who have a great record of voting with us in the UN, like Israel, good use of money. Military assistance to Pakistan is not there. On another foreign policy topic, Facebook, David in Deerfield asked, North Korea is thought to have nuclear weapons, but there are extreme sanctions on their country. Sanctions aren't working there. Sanctions can alienate people that you want to win over. Why are sanctions the best way towards Iran, or why can you be so certain about this? And the quick answer I would have is that I believe we should take the strongest non-military means available to deal with the growing threat from Iran. And I'm particularly worried about Iran because an organization from the UN, like the International Atomic Energy Agency, remember, was consistently right about Iraq. They said that the Bush administration overstated the threat. And as we then found out through a painful conflict, that threat on weapons of mass destruction was overstated, a great intelligence failure by the United States. But the IAEA had it right on Iraq. That's why I think that they are incredibly credible when they talk about what's happening in Iran. Their latest report says that the Iranians have restarted a tremendous enrichment program that has got them a considerable way to having fissile material for nuclear weapons. That military personnel have gotten information on how to build an atomic bomb. And that work is now ongoing to design a warhead for their long-range Shahab-3 missile. America is tired of war, and I don't think there's consensus to take military action, but a world in which a state sponsor of terror, Iran, that sponsors, for example, and funds Hezbollah and Hamas, that victimizes 330,000 Baha'is, that just arrested, for example, all of the fashion designers in the country with a unique set of crimes. And most importantly, has a head of state, Ahmadinejad, that regularly talks about erasing Israel from the map. They're probably the only head of state of a UN member talking about wiping another member off the planet. The thought of them having nuclear weapons, I think, should concern us all. We should not grant to our kids in the 21st century a nuclear-armed Iran, and especially the likelihood that they would then transfer those nuclear weapons to terrorist nations. And so I think the United States should move forward with crippling sanctions, especially against the central bank of Iran.
Well, I agree entirely. And I think if you take a look at it, not only is it, I think, a threat to our friends and allies in the Middle East, it's a threat to us. I think Iran is one of the biggest threats we have to our own national security. So the madman at the helm, Ahmadinejad, has said that he wants to wipe Israel off the face of the map, that they are the little Satan, which naturally begs the question, who's the big Satan? You
might have seen the Iranian ambassador on Morning Joe this morning that said America was the #1 terrorist nation.
Well, I certainly think when they talk about the little Satan being Israel, the big Satan is certainly us. And so when we talk about Iran going and marching towards nuclear weapons, I am very concerned about a container ship coming into Miami, a Los Angeles, or finding its way to the United States. And so having a nuclear armed Iran is absolutely unacceptable. And I think we have to put everything on the table. And certainly the thing that's going to be the easiest for us to move forward on is to put in crippling sanctions against Iran. It's absolutely critical that we do so. And I think it's something that we need to push the administration to enforce.
Especially after we had this news from our Attorney General, Eric Holder, that said the Iranian Revolutionary Guards Force tried to hire the Mexican drug cartel, the Zetas, to blow up a Washington, D.C. restaurant, actually a couple of blocks from where I live here in D.C. They said they would probably kill dozens of Americans, may even kill some senators. Didn't mention House members, but, in an effort to kill the Saudi Arabian ambassador to the United States. That just shows a unique level of irresponsibility that makes me very concerned if they have nuclear weapons.
Well, they're so bold as to say deterrence doesn't work. They're coming after the United States. It's very, very real, and we've seen it happen, and thank goodness we had folks on the DEA on the inside that were able to kind of thwart that effort. So let's go to another question from Twitter. The question is from Seth. The Illinois congressional delegation has long supported the cleanup of mercury pollution. Are you going to support the new mercury emission standards? Certainly, let me just say that I opposed the Train Act, which would have delayed implementation of the EPA's proposed, toxic mercury. Right. And so I think that when we look at just generally in terms of the environment for me, I think is something that's very near and dear to my heart. The first bill that I drafted and dropped in Congress was Great Lakes water protection. And when we look at that, I think that's absolutely critical. It's the jewel of our ecosystem. 95% of all fresh drinking water in the United States is in the Great Lakes. And I think that we need to go about our environmental policies with some extreme caution. So I consider myself an environmentalist and want to make sure that we're protecting the environment at every turn.
It's a pretty hot issue. First of all, we talked about removing nuclear waste from the shores of Lake Michigan. I applaud you on your legislation to ban sewage dumping in the Great Lakes, especially Lake Michigan. I was just struck by information that about 20 billion gallons of sewage are, or 20 million gallons of sewage are dumped into the Great Lakes each year. Almost half of that from one city, Detroit, which, by the way, we just saw on the news may be announcing that it is running out of money soon. Just about everything that Detroit has done has been the wrong thing to do. And then there's a debate in the Congress about enforcement of the Clean Air Act. We had cross-border regulations so that if one state is emitting and polluting the air of another state, federal courts mandated that EPA put forward other regulations, new regulations, to restrict that. And we estimate that on the order of between 10 and 20% of air pollution in Illinois would be reduced by this regulation. Obviously, eastern states in the United States even more concerned: Pennsylvania, sure, Delaware, the Northeast. I voted to make sure that those regulations go forward because I think that would have tremendous health benefits to the United States, as well as industries that have already invested in planning on this activity to go forward. So I think there is sensible environmental policy that can go forward on protecting critical ecosystems like the Great Lakes, on clean air and clean water. We shouldn't go overboard and have tremendous economic costs, but where it can be done safely and effectively, like your legislation banning sewage dumping, or making sure that one state can't heavily pollute the air of another state, it's common sense legislation and regulation that should move forward.
No question. We need to make sure that we're protecting our environment, and was pleased that I was actually recognized as Congressional Champion of the Outdoors, which is great, but we need to make sure we continue to do that. But we need to be sensible. We have stuff like Cement Mac, which again would impose regulations 3 to 5 times more stringent than Europe, which would put us at an enormous disadvantage. So there's some common sense things that we can do to still make sure we safeguard the environment.
A good policy for a guy who's the Troop 13 Boy Scout leader for Kennewick.
Amen.
I want to I'll kick it back to Congressman Dold, but I just want to say thank you to everybody for joining us. This is the first time we've done this, so let us know if you want us to do this again on Facebook, and we will take your questions and comments if you like this format, and make sure that you know more and more about how we're representing you in the Senate and the House.
Well, I want to thank you again for taking the time to join us, and certainly if you like this format, we want to hear about it, and certainly we want to encourage you to send this out to your friends and to your colleagues. And again, Facebook /Rep Dold, you've got it there, and same thing for Senator Kirk. We'd love to hear more from you. Please stay engaged. It's absolutely critical in terms of what we're doing here in Washington, so thank you so much.
Happy Thanksgiving, everybody.
Yeah, happy Thanksgiving.
Great. See you. Thanks, man.
Hey, thanks so much.